2:58 a.m., Minneapolis. From the air, the city appeared untouched, a clean grid of streets glowing softly, traffic signals changing on empty intersections. Snow pressed tight against the curbs, layered and settled as if it had always been there. Nothing suggested urgency. Nothing suggested intrusion. Except that, below ground, something had already begun to shift. The operation didn't announce itself. No sirens, no flashing lights. It arrived quietly. Unmarked vehicles slipped into position along service corridors most residents didn't realize existed. Headlights stayed dark. Radios stayed silent. Doors opened and closed with controlled precision. FBI and ICE personnel moved as blended units by design, ensuring no single team held the full narrative. This wasn't intimidation, it was containment. The objective wasn't a stash house, not a warehouse, not a border node. It was municipal infrastructure, 2 blocks from City Hall, behind a row of government garages labeled Facilities Maintenance. Thermal scans revealed an anomaly, a long, narrow void beneath reinforced concrete where none should exist. Linear, purpose-built. The kind of space that requires permits, inspections, and repeated approvals from someone who never asked why. At 3:04, the first door was accessed. It looked unremarkable, beige paint, standard hardware. The sort of doorway thousands of city employees pass daily without a second glance. It wasn't breached. It opened using credentials that were still active. The air beyond it didn't carry the damp smell of a basement. It was conditioned, filtered, cold. A gradual ramp descended, wide enough for carts, illuminated by evenly spaced industrial lighting, too precise to be improvised. Ventilation systems pulsed behind the walls, clean and functional. Someone had been maintaining this. By 3:07, the teams were below street level. The passage didn't resemble a hideout. It felt engineered, lane markings painted along the floor. Drainage channels cut cleanly into the concrete, directional symbols stenciled onto the walls, subtle and coded. This wasn't designed to conceal existence. It was designed to move volume efficiently, unseen and uninterrupted. Midway through the corridor, the tunnel branched. One route led toward a shuttered municipal parking structure. The other curved beneath a redevelopment zone, one of the mayor's most heavily promoted projects. Budgets approved, timelines extended, oversight postponed. At 3:12, they reached the first junction point. A reinforced chamber opened into a logistics hub that required no explanation. Pallet shelving, sealed containers, mobile carts labeled with dates and destinations. No branding, no identifiers, just numbers, weights, schedules. A digital display on the wall was still active, cycling through routes mapped across the city and beyond, each paired with time windows measured in minutes. This wasn't warehousing, it was coordination. Documentation followed quickly. Every detail logged. This stage wasn't about illegal goods yet. It was about volume, about consistency, about how frequently this system had operated without disruption. Then they located the ladder. It rose straight upward into darkness, terminating beneath a municipal office complex directly adjacent to the mayor's administrative wing. It wasn't concealed, it was built in, intended for regular use by people with authorized access. At 3:19, a secondary team entered the mayor's office suite from above. No alarms, no forced entry. The building accepted them as legitimate. That was the moment someone finally said it. This wasn't hidden. Behind the office, inside a secured room cataloged as archival storage, sat another access panel, another scanner, another soft confirmation tone. Inside, a compact data center hummed steadily. Local servers, redundant power, no external labels, no record of its existence in any city inventory. One monitor remained active. It displayed a financial interface, not personal accounts, not discretionary funds, municipal flows, development allocations, infrastructure budgets, service contracts, line items dull enough to pass audits without question. The totals continued to rise. $420 million, not stolen, redirected, every transfer authorized, every delay rationalized, every exception recorded, clean enough to survive review, invisible enough to expand. At 3:26, command was informed. This wasn't an operation targeting a mayor, It was the exposure of a system that had functioned beneath him or through him for years. And if Minneapolis had been built this way, the real question wasn't who else was involved. It was how many other cities were already structured the same way. By 4:41 a.m., the servers were on the move, not paraded, not displayed, sealed, cataloged, and escorted with care, treated less like trophies and more like fragile evidence. Because they were. This phase was no longer about what had been uncovered underground. It was about demonstrating how far above ground it reached, not dragged into daylight for cameras, but sealed, logged, and escorted with care. Handled less like seized property and more like something that could fracture if mishandled, because it could. This stage wasn't about what had been uncovered below ground. It was about demonstrating that the same structure existed far beyond it. The cyber suite came alive before sunrise. Overhead lights dimmed automatically, monitors powered on in staggered waves, the space filled with the steady, controlled hum of systems performing exactly as engineered. No one rushed, there was no need. The framework had a cadence. Once identified, everything else aligned around it. At 5:02, the first system images locked in. By 5:14, verification checks matched cleanly. By 5:27, the room fell into an underscore toggle of silence, not from failure, but from compliance. Nothing fought back. No dramatic encryption layers. No last-second wipes. Just directories labeled with reassuringly civic titles: redevelopment, mobility initiatives, public safety integration. Vendor folders written in language lifted straight from procurement manuals. Each data set presented a unique exterior, different branding, different mission statements, different public narratives. Beneath that surface, they were identical, matching directory architecture, identical timestamp rhythms, the same metadata signatures embedded deep. This hadn't been assembled on the fly. It had been replicated. A composite map began forming across the main display. Not streets or intersections, but flows. Nodes appeared at city garages, redevelopment parcels, non-profit offices, private parking structures. The connections mirrored zoning overlays and traffic impact studies, precisely where oversight thinned, where inspections lagged, where delays were routine and unremarkable. Then the financial layer snapped into focus. Money traveled clean routes, grants authorized, modifications justified. Contracts rolled forward. Funds entered labeled as public benefit and exited as service expenditures. No shell games, no offshore noise. Just domestic vendors with forgettable names and flawless documentation. The breakthrough wasn't disguising illicit money. It was converting legitimacy itself into propulsion. At 6:11, an analyst isolated the approvals trail. The same authority appeared repeatedly, sometimes directly, sometimes through delegated channels. Waivers issued, reviews postponed, temporary allowances quietly extended until they became permanent. There were no unexplained deposits, no kickbacks to trace, no pressure tactics to uncover. This wasn't corruption, it was design. By 6:39, the underground corridors fit perfectly into the picture. They weren't improvised criminal shortcuts. They were purpose-built logistics channels exploiting the city's own blind zones, maintenance schedules, utility rights of way. Construction timelines stretched just long enough to mask movement below them. Every physical route matched paperwork already on file. At 7:04, a second overlay appeared. Regional links illuminated, rail access points, interstate connectors, facilities positioned just outside habitual enforcement patterns. Minneapolis wasn't the origin point. It was a junction, clean, efficient, predictable. The figure surfaced again, not as a headline, but as an accumulated total: $420 million, distributed over years, across initiatives, through vendors that delivered exactly what their invoices promised, just not what the city believed it was funding. At 7:22, command reached a conclusion. This structure couldn't be dismantled incrementally. Any phased approach would trigger rerouting. The system was built to adapt, to isolate damage, to keep functioning. The objective shifted, not arrests, severance. Phase 2 would be executed simultaneously. Across the operations floor, warrants queued, account freezes prepared, air resources reassigned, border partners notified. This wasn't escalation, it was alignment. The network had learned government behavior, methodical, sequential, predictable. Now, it was about to confront something outside its assumptions. Movement everywhere, at the same moment, without advance signal. By 8:13, field units repositioned in silence. The tunnels beneath Minneapolis had become more than evidence. They were a blueprint, and if the blueprint worked here, it worked elsewhere. By the time the city stirred awake, the central question had already shifted. Not whether the mayor had direct involvement, but how many layers above and below him had been constructed to make direct involvement unnecessary. Phase 2 was already underway before most of the Midwest fully opened its eyes. No announcement, no visible surge. Just a subtle change in stance across dozens of cities at once. Vehicles already staged adjusted by blocks, not miles. Teams that had seemed dormant minutes earlier moved with intent. This wasn't pursuit. It was a synchronized shutdown. There was no public signal, no surge caught on traffic cameras. Only a subtle realignment across dozens of cities, all at once. Vehicles already staged shifted by a few blocks, not miles. Teams that had appeared in active moments earlier moved with intent. This wasn't pursuit. It was coordinated termination. At 9:02 a.m., warrants began clearing in clusters. Not single locations, not isolated offices, entire sectors, city contractors, redevelopment affiliates, transit vendors, nonprofits that existed mostly on paper, yet moved real volume through physical space. The objective wasn't immediate seizure, it was observation. What moved once pressure entered the system. The response was instant, routes recalculated by minutes, not hours. Trucks departed early, vans skipped routine stops and diverted to secondary sites that had passed inspection only months earlier. Inventory migrated between addresses that looked equally unremarkable on a map. This was the window analysts had anticipated. Motion, not documentation, exposed the architecture. Interdictions followed behavior, not warrants. In St. Paul, a facility registered for electrical maintenance opened onto a transfer floor, still warm from activity. Tire impressions were fresh. Clipboards sat abandoned mid-process. A whiteboard displayed time blocks only. Handoffs, not destinations. No names, no labels, just intervals. In Duluth, a parking structure closed for engineering review concealed a freight lift descending below the lowest recorded level. The space underneath wasn't storage, it was staging. Carts marked by weight, timetables taped directly to concrete, everything calibrated to windows measured in minutes. In Rochester, a nonprofit office emptied staff in under 2 minutes after the first financial freezes propagated. The public-facing areas were spotless. The basement was not. Investigators recovered plastic-sealed binders organized by week, each containing travel documents mismatched to the names printed on them. Dates aligned across multiple states. Destinations repeated. By 10:18, the conclusion was unavoidable. This wasn't a single criminal organization exploiting city systems. It was modular by design, each node capable of operating independently, yet optimized for connection. Failure didn't cripple it. Load shifted. Redundancy wasn't protection, it was strategy. At 10:41, coordinated account freezes struck balances that appeared harmless in isolation and catastrophic when linked. Compliance offices scrambled, phones rang unanswered, transfers queued, stalled, then failed. Money halted mid-flow, not because it was flagged as illegal, but because authorization vanished everywhere at once. That was when underground access points began to close. Teams in Minneapolis moved below street level to seal entrances identified through data correlation. Some were crude, others blended seamlessly into legitimate infrastructure. Utility covers, service corridors, maintenance shafts keyed to credentials that remained valid until they didn't. At 11:07, a convoy altered its pattern along Interstate 94. Speed changed by seconds, enough to miss a scheduled exchange. That hesitation was decisive. The stop occurred where the route curved just slightly away from routine. Inside the vehicle, nothing was labeled. It didn't need to be. The paperwork said exactly what the system required it to say. By late morning, Discovery stopped shocking and began weighing heavily. Tags, timetables, intake forms bearing dates that matched across cities. lists tracking people with the same language logistics firms use for freight. In some cases, names were absent altogether, only weights, ages, conditions, readiness. This wasn't disorder, it was management. At 11:53, a property adjacent to Minneapolis City Hall, officially designated as temporary office overflow, went dark. Power cut cleanly, network access severed. Inside, investigators found a compact operations room cleared of personal items, built for rapid abandonment. The only thing left behind was a printed schedule. No letterhead, no signatures, just times. By noon, the operational scope collapsed inward. Financial trails converged on the same intermediaries, 17 in total, each deliberately named to sound mundane. Fleet services, consulting firms, curriculum suppliers, food contractors. None produced measurable output. All moved funds with perfect timing. From there, the flow separated into layers engineered to withstand scrutiny, not evaded. At 12:27, the first administrator in the approvals chain was contacted. No arrest, no restraints, just a request for a conversation. The response came immediately. Calm, cooperative, prepared. The individual grasped the scale better than anyone present. They didn't ask what had been uncovered. They asked for the total. That was the moment investigators understood the most dangerous element of the system wasn't buried underground. It was how effortlessly everyone involved had operated in plain sight, confident the structure would absorb any pressure applied to it. For years, it had. By early afternoon, activity slowed, not because momentum had been lost, but because there was almost nothing left in motion. By mid-afternoon, activity tapered off, not from exhaustion, but from depletion. There was simply less left in motion. Routes fell silent. Timetables stopped refreshing. Dashboards that had updated every minute for years froze on stale timestamps. The system didn't fail loudly. It didn't crash. It exhausted its own authority. Inside the command center, the display transformed. Red indicators dulled to gray. Lines that once pulsed with traffic thinned, then disappeared entirely. What remained wasn't a triumph. It was a void, the negative outline of something that had existed for years and was now abruptly absent. At 14:06, formal notification reached the mayor. There was no theater, no cameras, no restraints. The meeting took place in a secured municipal office that still carried the faint odor of toner and burnt coffee. He listened without interruption. No visible reaction, no protest. When investigators mentioned the tunnels, he didn't ask where they were located. He asked how many had already been sealed. That count took longer to assemble than anyone expected. By then, investigators understood the truth. The mayor had never needed to oversee daily operations. He hadn't directed routes or approved shipments personally. His function had been quieter, structural. He was the guarantor of normalcy, the signature that kept exceptions alive, the voice that reframed delays as caution and oversight as flexibility. The system didn't depend on traditional corruption. It depended on continued permission, and that permission had been given. Again and again, properly, on schedule. By the third morning, Minneapolis woke to a city that looked the same and felt wrong. Buildings stood unchanged, streets were cleared, offices still carried their signage, but the processes that had quietly animated the city beneath the surface were gone. Municipal garages sat unused. Redevelopment projects stalled without explanation. Phone numbers that had always been answered rang unanswered. Emergency hearings piled up before transcripts from the raids were complete. Regulators struggled to explain how underground corridors, duplicated ledgers, and synchronized calendars had existed for years without tripping alarms. Public statements leaned on phrases like procedural gaps and oversight failures. Internally, the assessment was sharper. This wasn't an oversight. It was trust, deliberately engineered. Inside temporary care centers set up across the region, survivors began the slow work of orientation. Many had been relocated so often they no longer knew which state they had originally been taken from. Names replaced by identifiers, days reduced to schedules. Medical teams recorded patterns that mirrored the data recovered from servers, feeding cycles, sedation timing, transport readiness. Even recovery required dismantling logistics. Financial investigators abandoned projections. The totals no longer fit on briefing slides. Public money had flowed through vendors that never delivered tangible results. Contracts had renewed automatically because no one wanted to be responsible for questioning programs with pristine reputations. The funds had moved cleanly because they began clean. That was the innovation, not disguising illicit money, but converting institutional legitimacy into momentum. Within days, federal priorities shifted quietly. A new unit formed, not focused on drugs or trafficking alone, but on camouflage, schools, clinics, workforce initiatives, nonprofits. Institutions built on assumed trust rather than constant scrutiny. The lesson was unavoidable. The strongest cover isn't secrecy, it's credibility. The mayor never spoke publicly. Neither did most of the administrators questioned in the aftermath. Their silence wasn't resistance, it was routine. They had spent careers operating inside rules, not outside them. From their perspective, they hadn't broken the system. They had optimized it. One question, however, kept resurfacing in closed briefings. Why now? There had been no tip, no careless transaction, no frantic attempt to withdraw. What ultimately exposed the network wasn't greed or violence. It was expansion. Growth demanded one approval too many. One replication beyond tolerance. One pattern repeated often enough to register. The system had grown past invisibility. Weeks later, analysts were still pulling at loose threads. And deep beneath rote diagrams and financial dashboards were notes that never resolved. Design annotations written in a voice unlike anyone in custody. Reflections on how trust is manufactured, how reputations insulate activity, how oversight can be redirected without confrontation. The architect was never identified, only outlined. Someone who understood not just crime, but institutions. Someone who didn't need to move money or people. Someone who designed environments where others did it automatically. The operation in the mayor's city concluded. The tunnels were closed. The $420 million pipeline was severed. But the final judgment, buried deep in an internal report, was colder than any headline. This wasn't a cartel issue. It wasn't a political scandal. It was an architectural failure. Because when a system can be turned into a weapon simply by following its own rules, the greatest danger isn't those who exploit it. It's how long everyone else assumes it never will.